It's like a basketball game. It's hard to get them calmed down, you know. Got a whistle, we'll blow the whistle. Good morning, and welcome to our auditorium class here at Walnut Grove Church of Christ. And we welcome all our visitors and those that are joining us by way of social media. We're certainly glad that you're in our audience and encourage you to be back at each opportunity you might have. Just a few announcements, and then if there's others, you can share those with me as we go along. I'm just going to read those that we have that are sick and sympathy, and then other announcements we'll share during the main service. As far as we know, Bruce made the transfer to Lexington. Is that correct, Sue? They were going yesterday, so we're assuming that transfer went well. Pastor Lou said Jeff's family is doing better with COVID. Some of them still have it, and some are going back to work, so that's improving. Sue Lovett is in room 216 at Parkview, continuing her rehab. Gail English is at home with sickness. Sarah Irvin will have dental surgery this week. We want to keep her in our prayers. And Kara Smith. Kara is the lady that we built the ramp for at Sharp that was in the automobile accident. Her daughter, Navia, will have surgery at Vanderbilt later this week. They got an appointment tomorrow, and she's requested our prayers. Our sympathy extended to Sheila Dunn, the passing of her cousin Jason McCoy, and it also extended to Netha Faircloth and the passing of her sister Joanne Price. Joanne's visitation will be this afternoon at Collier's and the funeral tomorrow at Collier's. Are there any other announcements in that group that need to be made? Okay. Jerry Hobgood and Marilyn Stradling, both in the hospital. Any others? We'll begin our class. Jason?
Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. I'm so happy that you're able to be here in our Bible study. I hope you've had a good and profitable week, and we'll look forward to this week as well. If you would open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24, and we'll continue our study of the final week of the life of Christ. On our reading schedule, as you no doubt know, the reading that relates to our Bible study this morning comes from Matthew chapters 24 and 25 and the corresponding chapters in Mark and Luke. And so we'll use the passage in the Gospel of Matthew as what will follow today, but aware of the parallel passages as well. Let's begin reading here in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. And note the setting of what's going on here. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he said unto them, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say unto you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So Jesus alludes to something that is the destruction of that place. The temple of Jesus' day was an absolutely magnificent structure. And when we refer to the temple, we might in one sense refer to just that particular part that we know of as the holy place and the most holy place, where those different articles of furniture were and all the rituals that went with that according to the law of Moses. But the temple also means that whole compound, or that whole mountain, we might say, the top of that mountain, where Herod had enlarged massive courtyard areas and a series of steps And so this whole structure was a magnificent structure. And because of its location at a high place in the city of Jerusalem, it could be seen for a long ways, especially if you were at a vantage point, say the Mount of Olives, which Jesus and his disciples will shortly be. And looking back over that city, you could see this magnificent area. And so, as they are pointing out to him these beautiful buildings, Jesus said, look, this is going to be destroyed. Verse 3 says, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives, which is again just across a ravine from the city of Jerusalem, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, what will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age or the end of the age? And Jesus said to them, see that no one lead you astray. There used to be a so-called evangelist who would say in his campaigns and in his speeches, Matthew 24 is knocking on the door. What was that supposed to mean? Right? Oh, yeah. And what does Matthew 24 have to do with that? Well, you'll hear wars and rumors of wars. I mean, after all, have you heard the news lately? What's going on? The Russians are going to invade Ukraine. There's this pandemic. I mean, all you got to do is look at the news, and it's clear that Jesus is coming back soon. Allegedly. And Matthew 24 somehow plays into that narrative. But this is something you may hear. We've all heard it before. Look at what's going on in the news, and somehow that is an indication that the time is at hand. And we're not by any means trying to be condescending or ridiculing anyone, because people unwittingly, we would say, have been led to believe that. But our question this morning is that what Matthew 24 teaches? That we're going to look out in the world, we're going to see various events, and from those conclude Jesus is almost going to return. Is Matthew 24 teaching us that? And I think the related question, and a very important question for all of us, is what does Matthew 24 teach? You know, we can talk all day about what it doesn't mean, but I want to know what it means for me today and how it can help me live the Christian life, don't you? We want to know not just what it doesn't mean, but what it means for us today. So, let's think about what Jesus says in this chapter. It's a long chapter. We won't be able to talk about every verse at length. And it does carry on in chapter 25, that is relative to the same time frame. And that's really important to remember, that this, as Matthew gives it to us, represents a continuous period of time, some instruction, as Jesus and his disciples are on the Mount of Olives, and he is telling them these things, and we just don't stop with that at the end of 24, but he's continuing to teach at this period of time into what we're calling, for convenience sake, another chapter, right? Chapter 25. Now, let's just notice some things about what happens in these chapters. We've read the first several verses that give us the idea of what's going on. Jesus makes this statement about coming destruction of the temple area, and the disciples, of course, then ask, what are you talking about, and when's this going to happen? What are going to be the ways that we can know that this is coming and all of that? And what will be the end so Jesus begins to respond. And as we read through Matthew chapter 24 and on into chapter 25, we clearly see that Jesus is talking about what's going to happen. And we're reminded that Jesus knows the future. He knows what's going to happen. And he begins to talk about that. But as we read very carefully, we see that Jesus is going to talk about some things that will happen in that day, and then he will address some things that are yet in the future, and that is his final return. And so, as we read it very carefully, and we want to pay attention to the details that help us understand exactly what Jesus wants us to know. As we read here and we get the setting and we start reading the first part of the chapter, we see that Jesus is talking about exactly what he mentioned at first, and that is one stone not left upon another. This temple is going to be destroyed. He begins to describe the destruction of Jerusalem. And historically that happened and was finalized in the year AD 70. So about 40 years after Jesus is talking, relating these facts, they were fulfilled. But that's not going to be the end of the world. That's not going to be the judgment day, the final day. And that is what he goes on to talk about in very clear and uncertain terms. Right. Whether they understood that those things were different things is really beyond our concern. We're going to see what Jesus said. And Jesus talked about a local judgment of Jerusalem and the final judgment at the end. So let's see how he relates these facts about the future, the near future, and then what is clearly the final day. As we read through the first part of this chapter, we see Jesus is describing what he first mentioned. Not one stone left upon another. And he talks about it's going to be a dangerous time. It's going to be a time where you need to be careful, he says to the disciples, that no one leads you astray. So just start getting a hold of the big picture, we might say. The first thing Jesus says after they inquire for more information, see that no one leads you astray. And from there he begins to give them teaching that will help them avoid being led astray. What does he mean by led astray? Well, people are going to say, oh, look at all what's going on. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be led astray. Someone might say, the Christ is over here, or the Christ, he says, many false Christs will come. Don't be led astray. And so he begins to talk about persecution, a rising level of tension, and the concern that the disciples won't be led astray. And then he begins to talk about what they're going to clearly see. So just follow what he does here. He begins with a warning, don't be led astray. He says it's going to be intense and there'll be a rising level of anxiety and stress and persecution. But wait, let me tell you exactly what you're looking for. Don't be led astray. Don't let even rising levels of conflict alarm you. But you keep a watch out for something specific. And what is that? Well, look at verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. It's like here is the key. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now that's a very important verse. Jesus has, up until this verse, said, don't let anyone lead you astray. There'll be rising levels of conflict. Don't let anyone say the Christ is over here, the Christ is over there. Don't be led astray. Now, let the reader understand this. When you see, okay, there's something to see. See what? The abomination of desolation. What does that mean? Abomination means something that is detestable. And this detestable matter is going to bring destruction. The abomination that brings destruction. The detestable thing that brings devastation. When you see destruction, abomination, where? What does Jesus say? Not when you hear rumors, not when you hear of bad things just happening out there somewhere, not when tensions rise or there is the mere fact of persecution, but when you see a detestable thing bringing destruction, where? What does the verse say? In the holy place. What city is that in? Jerusalem. What did he talk about from the very beginning? What piqued the interest of the disciples to ask their questions? Not one stone is going to be left on another. When you see the detestable thing happening and bringing devastation in the holy place, then what? Those of you who are in western Kentucky, is that what he says? Those of you who are in Judea, flee to the mountains. That's not a hard verse to understand. That's not hard at all. That Jesus is talking about something that's going to happen in Jerusalem, and when his disciples see it, they need to flee. Now he goes on to make some other statements about this. He says, you don't need to wait around. Verse 17. He tells his disciples, let no one who is on the housetop go down and take what's in his house. Let no one who's in the field go back and take his cloak. Don't wait around. When you see this in the city of Jerusalem, it's time to go. Now in Luke's parallel, in Luke chapter 21, just maybe hold your place here and turn with me over there and read it. In Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation has come near. That is a definition of what abomination means. That the temple is surrounded by the pagan armies of Rome. This is what you're looking for. So you might want to write, if you like to make notes in your Bible, you could write over here in Matthew 24, verse 15, see Luke 21:20. When you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, this is the abomination of desolation prophesied by Daniel in Daniel chapter 9, the destruction of Jerusalem. So we see very clearly that Jesus, up to this point, is talking about something that is going to happen in Jerusalem, and those people living in that area have been warned. Don't be led astray by anyone in one way or another. Don't think, well, this is the temple of God. He's going to defend us. Don't let anyone draw you in to a conflict with the Romans. Don't be a part of that. Run. And when you see this, don't delay. Don't go down. Don't come in. Just go. And he indicates how this is going to be a difficult matter. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, it's going to be rough. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. This has nothing to do with the Old Testament restriction of the Sabbath day and Sabbath day travel, because Jesus is going to nail the old law to the cross. But this has more to do with gates that would be closed, difficulty to travel, as various things would happen on the Sabbath. It's harder to travel in winter. It's harder to travel with infants. And so Jesus is indicating by these warnings, when you have to flee, and when you have to flee immediately, it is not going to be easy. It is going to be a very difficult time. Jesus is talking about what's going to happen in Jerusalem. Now, to state the obvious, when good people, sincere people, but they have not studied all of Jesus' teaching carefully enough to avoid the misinformation, when people repeat things like, well, wars and rumors of wars, these are the signs of the time. And they take little phrases and apply it to something Jesus never intended. If Jesus is talking about the end of time, what good is it going to be to flee to the mountains? Or hope it's not winter? Or anything like that. These are recommendations to avoid the devastation brought by the armies. And if you just go somewhere else, you're going to be okay. And so this whole idea that Jesus is talking about the end of time here just doesn't fit his teaching and what he actually says. He's talking about a local event. Now, let's fast forward here to a very important verse at the end of this teaching. Look at verse 32. From the fig tree, learn its lessons. Jesus is going to sum up all the advice he has given. Don't be led astray. Here's exactly what you need to look for in Jerusalem. And when this happens and the armies surround the city, run. Run. Don't wait. Run. So learn what I'm saying. What? The lesson of the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaf, you know summer is near. And basically Jesus is saying by this picture, I've given you the information you need to know when the season has changed and it's time to leave. I've told you. I've given you the information you need to know what's going to happen. So, he says in verse 33, so also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, verily, verily I say to you. I mean, everything that Jesus says is true. Everything is important, right? But he calls attention to this with that familiar phrase. Verily, verily I say unto you. This generation will not pass away until all these things are accomplished. Now that's a very important verse, and it's not hard to understand. Everything I've just said, everything, all of these things will happen. When? In this generation. This generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. Now here's an interesting fact. Among folks who want to think that Matthew 24 is giving us signs of the ends of times and are indicating that Jesus is about to come back and the judgment day is going to happen, or the rapture, or whatever theory they espouse of final things, they appeal to verse 34 quite a bit. You know why I think that's important? Is because that people they're voting, you might say. They're by making various statements and putting different interpretations on a passage, they're saying, this verse is important. And some say, well, this generation refers to the Jews. So the Jews aren't going to pass from the earth until all these things be accomplished, and this is what's going to happen at the end of time and the gathering of Israel and all of this. Well, if we just listen to Jesus, he's going to tell us what he means. What he means is the ordinary thing that anyone who has not been misled ahead of time will think when they read this verse. Jesus says, this generation will not pass away. The people that are living now. The people that are born relatively in the same period of time. You know what a generation is. This generation shall not pass away. Jesus is using that term in the ordinary sense that ordinary people would understand. It does not have some strange nuance or meaning. Well, how do we know that? Because Jesus has used this expression in the normal sense repeatedly. And I'll just mention a couple of passages to you. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says, verse 16, who can I compare this generation to? There's our expression, this generation. Who can I compare this generation to? And then he begins to talk about and has been describing as he asked this question, those people who heard John and then those people who were hearing him. They didn't like John, they don't like me. They thought John was crazy, they think I'm a socialite, just rubbing shoulders with sinners, if you can believe that. Who can I compare this generation to? Who's he talking about? The people who were listening to then him and before him John. Those people living there. Take this passage from Matthew chapter 12, verse 41. The men of Nineveh will stand up in the judgment and condemn this generation. Who? This generation. Why? Because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here. This generation has rejected someone greater than Jonah. They've rejected the Lord. And he repeats the same thing in the next verse. The queen of the south will rise up and condemn this generation. Oh man, somebody greater than Solomon is here. Yet they have rejected him. Who's rejected him? This generation. And he repeats that again later in this very same chapter. 3 times in chapter 12 he refers to the people living then as this generation. And here we have in Matthew chapter 23, verse 36. Woe unto you, I'll back up to verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you build tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have participated in all of that, the shedding of the prophets' blood. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those murderers, those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you going to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the blood, the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say unto you, all these things will come upon this generation. That's right. So the people living and are born, that's what a generation is. And Jesus is using that in his teaching repeatedly. People living then, this is what's going to happen. So verse 34 is significant. That when Jesus is talking about Jerusalem being surrounded, when he has said, if you live in Judea, you need to flee, he says, all these things will be accomplished. This generation will see it. Now, as we move forward, not only do we have this time indication that these things are going to happen within that generation living at that time, we have these local references of Jerusalem, the holy place, Judea, the mountains. We have this advice about just move your location and do it immediately and you'll be spared. Flee to the mountains. Hurry, don't wait. We have these indications that it's a local matter that's going to happen in the days of that generation. Jesus says, verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Note the transition in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour knows no one, not the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And when you read from here on out, Jesus tells us exactly what he's talking about and exactly how we should think about it. That is, there's not one single sign after verse 36. There's not one single time when Jesus says, when you see this happening, then you need to run or you need to do this. In fact, now the illustrations that he uses and the parables that he tells have a different tone altogether. But of that day and hour knoweth no one, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be with the coming of the Son of Man. And he begins to give teaching and illustrations and instruction that when this happens, it's going to catch people totally off guard. When this happens, it will be sudden and unexpected. Or he puts it like this: at a time you do not expect. There's nothing after verse 36 that gives anyone some way to measure and conclude Jesus is almost here. There are no signs for that. All the signs in this chapter occur before verse 36, and Jesus says these things are going to be accomplished in this generation. And so that's a distinction that needs to be made. So he talks about Noah. And what were people doing? Going about their business, and they didn't know it until the flood happened. And what is his advice about that? So will be the coming of the Son of Man, verse 39. He gives an example. 2 people will be in the field, one will be taken, one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. And then he gives another example. Know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. And that becomes then the theme. Look at verse 50. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour when he does not know. Look at chapter 25 and verse 13. Watch therefore, for ye neither know the day nor the hour. You do not know when I will return. So be ready. It will be unexpected, sudden, and then it's too late. The companion theme with the idea of unexpected and sudden is, once the Lord comes, it's too late. Once the flood came, it's too late to say, oh, I want to do something about this. If an unfaithful servant is tempted by his master's delay to do what he's supposed to do, it's too late when the master comes back. It's too late when the bridegroom shows up to start preparing. It's too late, because his return will be sudden and unexpected. Now, let's address just a couple of questions. Someone will no doubt say, as they have, well, what Jesus is saying is you don't know exactly what day and hour. And so we have signs to know, a general feeling, hey, you see what's going on in the news, he's coming back. No, he doesn't tell us the day or the hour, but these are the signs of the times. That's not what he means, for the reasons we've already specified. Number one, he said that these local events that he predicts will happen in that generation. So we can't ignore that Jesus says when these things will happen. Second, his illustrations and his teaching of what he means by the day and hour are clear. You cannot prepare for the coming of Christ by watching and anticipating what's going on. It's going to be like the flood. It's going to be like the master that returns. It's going to be like the bridegroom. It's going to be like people are working and going about their business, and it happens. That's what he means. In contrast to what he said would happen in those days when his disciples lived. So we got to look at all the information here, and we can't take this expression day and hour and run with it and just throw verse 34 in the trash. We can't do that. It guides us in terms of interpreting the first part of this chapter. Now, here's the other question. Here's the other objection. Look at verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. And He will send out His angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather His elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Somebody said, well, that sounds like the judgment day. That's judgment day right there. So how can you say everything before verse 34 is that generation? That clearly is the judgment day. Well, here's where we want to broaden our understanding of the kind of descriptive language Jesus is using. We're right, we're correct to see in that language a judgment day, but not the judgment day. Jesus is clearly describing the events that are going to happen in Jerusalem as a judgment day, but not the judgment day. In other words, He is indicating what He has said previously in the parable of the wicked husbandman, in the parable of the wedding feast, that when this place is destroyed, this is not ultimately the action of the Romans. There's something deeper going on here. This is a judgment day upon this nation for their rejection and crucifixion of the Christ. And that would then, if we understand these verses are still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, indicating it is a divine judgment, it would continue to help us see everything before verse 34 is that generation. The question is, are we just saying that so it fits our view? Or do we have good reason to say this language has been used, and the Jews were familiar with this language, which is used for divine judgment on nations? And the answer is that if we were as familiar with the prophets as His disciples and Jews of that day probably were, we would hear very familiar language here regarding divine judgment against nations. So let me point out several passages to you in the few minutes we have remaining. In Isaiah chapter 13, we have a description of God's judgment against Babylon. And I'll point out to you that Babylon was not destroyed as it was by the Medo-Persian Empire until 539 BC. Isaiah is prophesying 200 years before that, and prophesies against many nations. So one of the strategies in Isaiah's prophecies involve God is looking into the world, God is judging people, and He will bring justice upon various nations if that's what He intends to do. So, if you have your Bibles open to Isaiah 13, you'll notice in verse 1 the oracle concerning Babylon. That's what we're talking about. And notice in verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord comes. What is the day of the Lord? Well, that's the judgment day. Well, not always. In this instance, the day of the Lord is the day He's going to bring judgment upon that nation. Babylon. And notice the language used. The day of the Lord comes, a judgment day against Babylon, cruel with anger and fierce anger to make the land desolate and destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Does that sound familiar? That's the language Jesus used. And let me refer, for time's sake, let me just refer to these other scriptures. In Isaiah 34, verses 4 and 5, we have a prophecy against Edom, or in some versions, Idumea, same area. The Edomites, the nation of Edom, God declared a judgment day. And the same kind of language is used. Now let me ask you this question. When Babylon was destroyed as God foretold, did the stars fall from the sky, literally? Did the moon fail to give its light? No. These are indications through this symbolic language that God is creating upheaval in the world as if He is intervening in normal affairs, as if the sun were to go dark and the stars fall from the sky. This is God intervening into the normal activity of human life. We see in Ezekiel 32, verses 7 and 8, the same kind of language. We see in Joel 2:28, the same kind of language that applies to the establishment of God's kingdom, the church, that Peter says was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. In Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 1, the Bible says that God rides upon a swift cloud. So the reference to the coming in the clouds is not always the judgment day. What Jesus describes is a judgment day. What He describes is what is going to happen in that time on the city of Jerusalem. But then there is going to be the judgment day. And nobody's going to look out here in the world and start putting together various international events or famines or pestilence or anything like that and say, oh, the Lord's going to come, because when the Son of Man comes, it's going to be like in the days of Noah. It's going to be like a man who comes back to his household unexpectedly. It's going to be like the bridegroom who comes with no announcement at a time when we do not expect. As Paul would say, as Jesus here Himself said, like a thief in the night. That's why Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 1, let's not concern ourselves with times or seasons. Let's be ready, for at any moment the Lord may return. So that's our consideration of this chapter, and chapter 25 reinforces the Lord's teaching about the second coming, the judgment day, with these parables and teachings about being ready at any time. Thank you this morning for your interest in the Scriptures and being a part of our Bible study.